Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Zuzanna Gwadera. I am a research assistant and program administrator here at the IISS, and I work as part of the Missile Dialogue Initiative. This webinar is a launch event for a new MDI research report, which was co-authored by Kolja Brockman and Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, titled Missile Proliferation and Control in the Asia-Pacific Region. The starting point for this research paper is that amid growing geopolitical tensions in the Asia-Pacific and the increased perceived utility of missiles, more states are acquiring more and more diverse missile systems, and in some cases also exporting them. At the same time, regional participation in formal mechanisms that are aimed at curbing the spread of missile technology appears patchy at best. But the questions of how regional states have become and continue to evolve as missile possessors, producers, and in some cases also exporters, how they engage with missile non-proliferation regimes, both formally and informally, and where we go from here, these are all not very straightforward questions. So I'm very happy to have with me today the authors of the paper, Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, who is professor and director of the East Asia Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, where he teaches courses on arms control issues in Northeast Asia and Chinese nuclear policy. And Kolja Brockman, who is an independent consultant and a non-resident senior researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Kolja conducts research in the fields of export control, non-proliferation, and technology governance, focusing on controls on emerging technologies and intangible transfers of technology. Quick rules of the road. Jeffrey will speak first for about 10 minutes. Then Kolja will deliver his remarks for about 10 minutes also. And afterwards, you will get the opportunity to ask your questions to the speakers using the Zoom Q&A function, which you should see at the bottoms of your screen. Please keep your questions clear and concise. And if you'd like to address your questions to any speaker in particular, please feel free to indicate their name. With that, I very much look forward to the conversation. And Jeffrey, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. I think this is a really important time to be looking at the state of missile proliferation in the Asia-Pacific region, in part because it's a moment of such dramatic change. My section of the paper starts with an observation about how far we have come when it comes to this issue of missile proliferation in Asia. And the observation is something like this. When the missile technology control regime was created, it has a series of technical parameters in it. So the basic idea is the definition of a Category 1 system of a missile that can carry a 500-kilogram payload to 300 kilometers range. That 300-kilometer range was set for the Korean Peninsula. It is a recognition of the geographic reality of the peninsula in a geopolitical sense, more than it really is a technical judgment. And so we began this conversation sort of, 30 or 40 years ago with Asia being an area of proliferation concern in terms of the development of arsenals. Today, to give you a sense of how much things have transitioned, the example I begin with at the opening of the paper is to sort of ponder what would happen if the conflict over Ukraine were to escalate, if Russia's aggression against Ukraine were to suddenly expand to a larger war with NATO. In that event, assuming we didn't all die very quickly in a nuclear war, Russia is very likely to use ballistic missiles against Poland. And if they did so, they would very likely use some of the ballistic missiles that they have been importing from North Korea. If that were to occur, then South Korea would almost certainly respond with the ballistic missiles that it has imported and that it is learning to produce itself. And Poland's missiles are South Korean. So we instead of living in an era in which the Korean Peninsula is a net importer of missiles, we now live in an era in which they are a net exporter, which I have to tell you, for someone of my age, is a very strange transformation. Similarly, when I started in this business, the notion that the United States might sell Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles to countries in Asia was quite surprising, and in particular, the idea that Japan might buy several hundred would have been front page news. But the United States is now in the process of selling hundreds of Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles to Japan, and there is not a peep. And I think these two stories demonstrate the degree to which missile proliferation has been fundamentally normalized in the region. I really want to make 2 points in this regard. The first is just to sort of describe the degree to which missile proliferation has already occurred in the Asia-Pacific region. And then I want to make an argument about the way in which this has largely been the result of the perceived utility of these weapons and the technical pathways that conventional systems may provide to longer and more strategic systems. I think we all know very well about China and North Korea's ballistic and cruise missiles. There's probably very little reason to talk about those in any depth. What I think is less widely appreciated outside of expert circles is the degree to which, certainly starting in Northeast Asia, that South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan have all built or are in the process of building their own long-range conventional strike systems based on ballistic and cruise missiles. South Korea has an extremely large arsenal of ballistic missiles, certainly capable of ranging the entire Korean peninsula and sort of deep into China. This includes both a family of the Hyunmoo series of solid propellant ballistic missiles, but it also includes at least one long-range cruise missile. And to give you a sense, the South Korean Defense White Paper says that South Korea has about 60 missile launchers. My colleagues and I at the Middlebury Institute, we spend a lot of time looking at satellite images of missile bases around the world. And we do things like count garages, and we are certain that there are about twice as many missile launchers as the South Koreans are declaring. We simply count bases and garages. And so, you're looking at a force of, we think, well in excess of 100 ballistic and cruise missiles capable of reaching targets throughout North Korea. Similarly, Taiwan has a long range, probably 1,000, maybe 1,500 kilometer range cruise missile, which is rarely, if ever, talked about. Again, this is a missile that has been periodically described by Taiwanese officials. It has not, it's been seen once very briefly. We haven't seen this largely because the United States has exerted pressure on Taiwan not to show off the missile. There's some reporting from about 15 or 20 years ago where Taiwan wanted to show this missile in a parade, and the United States prevailed upon Taiwan not to show it off. And we had a case a few years ago where the Taiwanese were deploying the system in trucks with liveries painted to look like delivery vehicles. So the Taiwanese have for political reasons, chosen to obscure this capability, which is one reason we don't talk about it, but it certainly exists. And now there is the case of Japan. And I think the case of Japan is particularly interesting because, again, I think maybe even 10 years ago, but certainly 20 years ago, the idea of Japan acquiring long-range precision ballistic and cruise missiles would, I think, have been seen as extremely alarming. But given the proliferation environment, I think that we've all become normalized to, again, there seems to be very little discussion of it. Japan is developing a long-range cruise missile, which is notionally a follow-on to its Type 12 anti-ship missile. I think the word follow-on here is probably a little bit misleading. My sense is that it's likely to be a profoundly new missile. And Japan also has a short-range ballistic missile with a gliding warhead under development, and is doing some research on scramjets. Now, this is sort of Northeast Asia, which I think we're all relatively aware of. I think people don't understand the degree to which we are also seeing proliferation in Southeast Asia. And again, I don't want to go through every country, but it's important to keep in mind that countries like Vietnam have imported anti-ship cruise missiles and are developing their own domestic capabilities. Vietnam also imported a series of Scuds in the 1980s, and those capabilities appear to be either something between well-maintained and in the process of being modernized. And Indonesia, for example, is the first country to import Turkey's Bora short-range ballistic missile. So this process we've seen in Northeast Asia is, I think, moving to Southeast Asia. And then finally, I wouldn't ignore Australia, which I think has very open and direct plans to become a producer of long-range missiles and ultimately an exporter of those capabilities. So why are we seeing such a proliferation? Well, I think the phrase which Zuzana used at the beginning is correct. It's their perceived utility. And there is, in fact, something unusual about the Asian domain, which is it's fundamentally a maritime domain. And so most of the countries that are developing these capabilities begin with anti-ship missiles and surface-to-air missiles, and to a lesser degree, space launch programs. But because they see these things as being useful in the maritime domain, they develop relatively short-range capabilities in this area, and they grow them. So, for example, the Taiwanese land attack cruise missile is an outgrowth of their own domestic anti-ship missile program, as is the Japanese cruise missile program. In the case of the ROK, their successful development of surface-to-surface ballistic missiles is built on the back of U.S. assistance with making surface-to-air missiles. And so the perceived utility of these missiles is, I think, driving conventional interest. And even when countries are acquiring shorter range systems, these are often either the demand gateway to future systems, or they may also be a technical gateway. The last point I want to make, and this I think turns the situation over to Kolya, who can talk about some of the practical ways in which we can confront this problem, is that there is not a neat and clean technical distinction between systems that fall below Category 1 and systems that exceed Category 1. These systems are, in many ways, really the same systems with relatively small modifications, which is why it's possible to see countries work their way up to increasingly more capable systems. I think one good example of this is the BrahMos cruise missile, jointly developed by Russia and India, which is marketed pretty widely, and which some countries in Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, are going to take delivery of. India has this system. It is exported in a configuration that is not capable of exceeding Category 1 of the MTCR. But India has tested the system to much longer ranges. And when Indian officials were asked about this, they said, well, it was a software fix, right? So the argument is that the system they are selling is either locked or has an inadequate guidance system to perform at longer ranges. But in terms of propulsion and other things, it's certainly quite capable. And so while I do believe that the systems being exported probably are compliant, and I don't think that it's necessarily a trivial thing to alter the software or to improve guidance, I think that also illustrates the degree to which these lines can be quite blurry and be quite difficult to enforce. Fortunately, however, there are people like Kolya who do worry about such blurry lines and who worry about the challenges of enforcement. And so I think this is a pretty good place for me to stop and turn it over to him, who I am certain will remind us that there is more to life than just Cat 1.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Thank you for giving us a primer on just the profound change that the missile landscape in the Asia Pacific has undergone over the past, several decades. And thank you also for bringing this over to Kolya, who will now give us the other side of the coin, which is the engagement with missile control regimes. Thank you so much, Kolya.
Thank you, Susie. And also, I'd like to take the opportunity again to thank IISS to let us write this piece, have discussions about it in Tokyo, and continue those discussions today. Just to briefly say, I'm speaking in my personal capacity as an independent consultant today. So anything I'm saying should be seen as representing other institutions that I'm associated with. So in my brief presentation today, I'll essentially pick up where Jeffrey just left off and consider the extent to which states in East and Southeast Asia have joined, subscribed to, or engaged with the multilateral missile non-proliferation and export control instruments that we currently have, and thus how they are contributing to controlling the proliferation of missile technology in the region, but also beyond. So Jeffrey mentioned the MTCR already, but the main instruments that stand out in the area of missile non-proliferation are perhaps the Hague Code of Conduct against ballistic missile proliferation, the Missile Technology Control Regime, and a little less, but also still relevant, the Wassenaar Arrangement. I'll get to each of those in a second, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that all states have an obligation under UN Security Council Resolution 1540 to have adequate systems in place to prevent exports of dual-use items contributing to nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons programs and their delivery systems, which includes first and foremost missiles. Now, the Hague Code of Conduct against ballistic missile proliferation, you see already in the title, ballistic missile proliferation, so we're not talking about cruise missiles, unfortunately. Short HCOC, is both a political commitment by states not to contribute to the proliferation of ballistic missiles capable of delivering weapons of mass destruction, but it's also a set of confidence-building measures through which the subscribing states share pre-launch notifications and annual declarations about their ballistic missile programs and their space launch vehicle programs. I think maybe we can bring up the presentation now, because we created some neat visuals to show a bit of sort of like how this looks like in the region. And as you can see from the map here, there are some states in the region, at least, that subscribe to and participate in the HCOC, including Japan, South Korea, India, the Philippines, Singapore, Cambodia, and perhaps also worth mentioning to the south, Australia and New Zealand. There are, of course, quite a few states who chose not to participate in the regime. In this case, the HCOC is actually open for subscription by all states, so there are essentially no limits for states joining. The Missile Technology Control Regime, or MTCR, on the other hand, is a multilateral export control regime through which primarily missile technology suppliers have thought to harmonize guidelines for applying restrictive export controls on what Jeffrey already mentioned, particularly sensitive missiles with the capability to deliver at least 500 kilograms of payload to a range of at least 300 kilometers. But the big difference here is that the MTCR is not open to all states. It only admits states by consensus decisions of all partner states. Jeffrey already mentioned it. It's not all just about Category 1. The MTCR also creates and regularly updates control lists, which describe essentially which goods and technologies are relevant for missile technology today. And that is the basis how states apply controls to transfers of such items. They're also really institutionalized by now. So states exchange and provide good practice guides on how different export control challenges can be overcome. They share which licenses they deny, and there's an exchange both about on the technical level on missile technology, but also on the enforcement and implementation level. So that's really important to keep in mind as well. Similarly, the Wassenaar arrangement also has control lists. It's more focused on conventional arms and related dual-use goods, and has a bit of a different focus, more on preventing destabilizing accumulations of weapons and threats to international and regional peace and security. As I mentioned already, the regimes are mostly composed of supplier states, and their membership has mostly stagnated since about the mid-2000s. And that is largely because the participating states cannot agree on admitting more states into the regime, rather than a lack of interest from states that are currently outside of the regime. If we look at the situation, you can see that on the map again, it's actually only Japan and South Korea that participate in both regimes from the region, and there's no states in Southeast Asia who currently are in either of those regimes. Again, India, Australia, and New Zealand are very important players, and I think at this point it's also worth mentioning both Russia and the United States also participate in both. China does not. Seeing this, it might appear that there's actually very low commitment and capability of states in the region to contribute to missile non-proliferation, either by implementing effective export controls or by participating in confidence-building measures to reduce escalation risk, but also to increase transparency. So merely looking at that participation in the instruments paints too narrow and perhaps a false picture, I would say. Therefore, it's really important also to take into account the national export control systems of states in the region. So we can jump to the next slide. So for the paper, essentially what I tried to do was also take and consider the evolution and current status of national export control systems of states in the region. And really up front here, there's no one perfect way to measure this, proxy or assessment. So what I did was compile a few that just give an indication sort of like where we stand, and that provides sort of like that complementary picture to just considering participation in the instruments. So when we're looking at what states have reported in their 1540 matrices about if they have actually adopted control lists for delivery systems, the picture is actually quite different. There's quite a few states who have done it. Some even have done it, but not reported it. But that already is quite different. If we take, for example, the peddling peril index, many states in the region are actually assessed to have either comprehensive or at least somewhat comprehensive export control legislation in place. If you look at the overall scoring there, that I think also gives you sort of like an indication of how you might need to take this with a bit of grain of salt, because it's trying to combine many different factors. And in some cases, I found that does not necessarily match the assessment of, for example, of capacity building providers that work with these states on improving their controls, and others who have looked at export controls in the region. Speaking of capacity building and outreach, we can jump to the next slide. A lot has happened in the region, and a lot has been done in order to improve the export control systems of states in the region. The MTCR itself is doing outreach missions, as you can see on the screen, and quite intensely to some states in the region who either have a big role to play in terms of transit and transshipment, and in general, the region has been addressed quite a bit. There have also been very comprehensive programs to build capacity in the region for a long time, and particularly by the EU with its EU P2P program, by the United States, particularly through the EXBS program and the PPP program. I won't go into much detail here. There's some differences, and there's still room for improvement on some coordination between those activities. But suffice it to say, a lot has actually happened in terms of building states' capability to contribute to preventing proliferation in the region. A lot still to be done, but the picture is certainly more complex than you might think when just looking at that sort of initial map with participation in the regime. So where does that leave us with a view to the possible contribution to preventing proliferation of missiles and missile technology, and sort of reacting to the observations that Jeffrey has made about the trends in the region. And I think one thing that we need to also remind ourselves about again is the restrictive controls that sort of like the MTCR prescribes. That is based on us wanting to prevent the proliferation of delivery systems of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And in today's missile world, there is not such a clear difference between the types of systems anymore. The range and the payload are not really distinctive features that enable you to make that distinction, whether it's a conventionally armed missile and whether it's a WMD capable missile. To some extent, you're also left with the question, to what extent do we still want that? It is currently still sort of like the one solution that we have, or the one answer to the problem, because there is no universal treaty on missile non-proliferation or something like that in place. So we kind of have to do to a certain extent with what we have. So looking forward, I think there's a big question mark behind the role that ASEAN can play in the region and taking forward export controls and mainstreaming it. There's certainly been a struggle to really get that topic on the agenda and keep it there. There have been quite a few efforts, both through ASEAN itself and the ASEAN Regional Forum. A lot of regional organizations, think tanks, etc., have tried to work towards informing what that could look like in the future. But ASEAN is still sort of very busy with establishing their economic market. And I think that will sort of like be an impediment, at least for a while, until that moves along, before a system will be adopted that could be harmonized across the region. But sort of like in terms of long-term vision for mainstreaming, particularly export controls and harmonization, I think we still have to work with that. We have regional champions with Japan and South Korea, which have very much been at the forefront at sort of like the regional dialogue on this. Japan is hosting the Asian Export Control seminar every year, which has become the sort of like central event where states in the region, the capacity building providers and other states exchange, where the regimes participate as well. Having SysTech and COSTI as agencies that, particularly when it comes to outreach to industry, both nationally but also across the region, have played a really big role. That's something that needs to be taken forward. And to some extent, there's also still a need to rethink a bit how we look at export controls, particularly in the current environment. And in the region, I think the narrative of looking at this as means to safeguard trade and enable trade in high-tech items, because it shows that the state can secure the state and prevent re-exports, unauthorized re-exports, for example, is an important one. There's topics on the current agenda which can be taken up as starting points. For example, new space, with more and more commercial space actors also being created in the region. So that's a starting point. But of course, we kind of also have to come down to the reality that with export controls, the geopoliticization and sort of like the lack of trust that we're seeing is certainly a big barrier at the moment that, all states in the region would need to work together to sort of overcome that to the extent possible. I'll leave it at that, and happy to expand more on any of that in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kolja. And as questions are flowing in, and I just remind everyone to submit your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. I'm going to perhaps start with just more general follow-up questions for both of you. So Jeffrey, in the paper, you explained the history of missile proliferation in the region in the context of 3 eras, and you've touched upon this already a little bit. These eras are defined by technology and by conceptual approaches. Could you perhaps explain how you define those eras and elaborate a little bit on the era that we're currently in, and what its characteristics are? And you also mentioned that obviously the Asia Pacific is primarily in a maritime domain, but of course, initially many countries have started with anti-ship missiles. These and their inventories are now changing and evolving, and they're much more diverse. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate a bit on what kind of missile technology and for what missions countries in the Asia Pacific are seeking such capabilities. And Kolya, you very much touched upon how the relative seeming lack of interest is not exactly what it seems in the Asia Pacific in formal non-proliferation regimes, and that there's quite a bit of activity under the surface. And you also mentioned that in the case of MTCR specifically, there is a rule of consensus for admitting new members. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on was there an interest from several countries in the region in joining that then was shut down by the MTCR partners? And also, and this is a question from Tim Wright from IISS, considering the MTCR consensus rule for adding new members, are there any countries in the Asia Pacific that you think Russia and the West could mutually agree would be valuable additions to the MTCR, and who might be interested in joining? So Jeffrey, why don't we start with you and then go to Kolya?
Great. Yes. So the taxonomy in the paper that I created was to sort of imagine three distinct eras. The first era, which runs sort of up until maybe the late 1960s, early 1970s, is the era in which we thought of guided missiles as being just a new capability that everyone might want to have. And so there's fairly rapid proliferation of relatively short-range systems in this period. So this is, for example, one of the Soviet Union's earliest large arms sales is to Indonesia. And so you see a number of, for example, Soviet sales of missile attack boats in this period. There's sort of a transition in the 1970s where we start to think about how these capabilities relate to the delivery of weapons of mass destruction. We think about the relative inaccuracy of a lot of these systems, especially at significant ranges. And so missiles almost, they become this thing that are held by nuclear states. But for the most part, other than, there are some short-range capabilities that are still being proliferated, but we have a much more non-proliferation-oriented focus. We really begin to associate long-range ballistic and cruise missiles with nuclear delivery systems, and we treat it as a proliferation problem. With the demise of the INF Treaty, I think we are probably entering a new era in which we think that, again, we perceive the utility of these systems, and we perceive their utility at much longer ranges. And so I think the normative case against the proliferation of these systems is just going to be much, much harder to make. So, the example is that the United States, I think, was very reluctant initially to send ATACMS to Ukraine. That's now been done. We've seen the French and the UK governments have sent Storm Shadow. The German government obviously still has a very vigorous internal debate about the wisdom of sending Taurus. But we're starting, I think, to be much more comfortable with exporting these systems at much longer ranges. And so that I think really is driven by this perceived utility, which really emerges not from the propulsion systems, but really from the increase in accuracy, the ability to use these systems at significant distances with some reasonable hope of military effect. Now, I should pause here and say I really like, as Zuzana said, this phrase perceived utility, because I think we have a lot of expectations for how effective these systems are going to be, and there's maybe not necessarily the same level of evidence of this in actuality. I think Iran, for example, and not that it's in the Asia Pacific, but has spoken a great deal about how it considers very accurate ballistic missiles to be an important part of its arsenal. And we saw that at 1,500 kilometers range, their missiles are actually quite inaccurate. They were both unreliable and inaccurate. So partly that may be that Iranian missiles are poor, but partly that may be also that, you know, we may overperceive the value of these systems at the moment. But regardless, I think we do now see them as valuable. And in particular, in the maritime domain of the Asia Pacific, I think one of the leading drivers of missile acquisition will be anti-ship missiles, particularly anti-ship cruise missiles. So most countries we see starting missile programs are at least initially interested in this mission. It has a particularly important conventional role for them. My concern is that over time it may well lead to other programs, particularly land attack cruise missiles. I think to a lesser extent we see this is true of surface-to-air missiles. Those programs also are pretty widely held, and I think also can be converted into surface-to-surface missiles. And then to a much lesser extent, although not zero, I think we have to be sort of aware of the possibility of space launch programs contributing to proliferation.
Thank you very much, Kolya.
Yeah, one of the things that we get with the confidentiality of the MTCR is that, particularly when it comes to the membership questions, who is applying, you know, have the member states actually considered it? There's little information there. So we don't really know to what extent states from the region have applied, with the exception of China. And the story of China and the MTCR is sort of like one that very much has gone back and forth. So at different times, China has actually indicated its strong interest in joining the MTCR, while at different times it's very much rejected it. And this has sort of like gone back and forth quite a few times. A lot of it also had to do with how the United States reacted. And essentially, what we can tell from what is in public sources is that at different times, particularly the US actually had rejected China's membership application, mostly pointing officially to its proliferation record and to then the lack of actual export control capabilities in its national system. Now, it's sort of like gone back and forth quite a bit also recently. I think in 2019, the then chair of the MTCR New Zealand actually met with Chinese interlocutors and sort of like brought the message of we're ready to re-engage in this. China has done actually significant efforts of you know, reforming and beefing up its national export control system and related systems as well. But now, most recently, in two UN General Assembly resolutions on what they described as peaceful uses, China has actually issued, let's say, thinly veiled criticism of the regimes and basically have called for a UN-based system that gets rid of the sort of like limited membership nature of the regimes, and you know, has accused them of being too discriminatory and of particularly Western states abusing the regime's rules. So right now it's sort of like very unsure where we stand. China officially says, you know, they're okay with the regimes and they're actually applying the MTCR guidelines and control lists. In practice, you know, they have adopted or have at least taken something from the control lists, but you know, we currently don't see that as going forward. I mean, you know, China is a member of the NSG, so on the nuclear export control side. But it's really somewhat in limbo, and paired with that geopolitical struggle at the moment, I don't really see that going anywhere. last thing you asked was who could states agree on? My take would probably be Singapore. Singapore has really taken very good steps and has now a very comprehensive and effective export control system in place. And I think in the way that it sort of like has been relatively, let's say, neutral on many things. I think that would be a candidate that I could think of, though I do not actually know whether Singapore has applied or is currently interested in joining the MTCR.
Thank you very much, Kolya. And staying on the subject of China, as you both touched upon it a little bit, a question from Doug Barry. Do you think that the approval of Tomahawk for Australia and Japan risks precedent setting that could be used by China or Russia to justify the export of similar range system? Accepting, of course, that China is not an MTCR member, Russia is. And kind of building onto that, Kolya, you mentioned obviously that China applied to join the MTCR and its application has apparently been rejected by the US. So do you think that this might have been a mistake on the US's part? I'll ask you very bluntly. And do you think that China may have kind of stuck a little bit more to the non-proliferation norm had it been accepted to the regime? Jeffrey, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think if this sale had been made 10 years ago, I would have said that it was a precedent-setting mistake. But I think in the current environment, I'm less alarmed by it because it occurs in the midst of what is kind of a free fall in relations between the United States on one hand and Russia and China on the other. So, given that the United States and China have sort of failed to agree on Chinese membership in the MTCR, given the degree to which the world is dividing up into blocks, given the sort of enthusiasm that Russia has for importing large numbers now of North Korean munitions, I think I had very, very low expectations of Chinese restraint in the future. That doesn't mean that it's all the Chinese fault. I think it's a sort of mutual failure on both of our parts to really find a way forward together in which we restrain these technologies. But now that kind of the horse is out of the barn, I feel like the sale of the Tomahawks is essentially the second kick of the mule.
I think I tend to agree with Jeffrey here in terms of that it's not necessarily something that would have changed things. I mean, for sure, it has already been something that, China and Russia have used as ammunition. Well, particularly China actually has used as ammunition in criticizing the practices of the United States and to a certain extent of the MTCR as well. I think when we started our big MTCR project just now, like 3.5, almost 4 years ago, we were actually worried about this and pointed this out as something where, yeah, this is, it's an easy thing to pick up for criticizing the situation. Yet again, looking back at the situation now, sort of like with how things have developed, yeah, I think they're very much I'm with Jeffrey. I think we're unfortunately on a track that's not easily reversed in this area. In terms of whether it would have changed anything with Chinese proliferation behavior, I'm not really sure. I mean, if we look at sort of like how China has been interacting and playing its role in different international organizations, particularly during times where the United States sort of like withdrew or were less leading than they were in the past, they have to a certain extent sort of like stepped in and asserted themselves a bit, somewhat changing the agenda or the narrative a bit. And so I don't know, that it would have created the opportunity to have that discussion at that level. And I mean, perhaps then there would have been more interest to actually contribute to the what I still see as very valuable exchanges, particularly on sort of like the technical level and implementation level of export controls. But yeah, in the end, it is a counterfactual, so it's hard to say what we would see. And the current situation obviously sort of has very much turned away from this.
Thank you very much, both. Moving on to the higher end of the missile-related technology, Hiroaki Nakanishi is asking if it is possible for the global missile technology proliferation, well, non-proliferation regime, to facilitate some sort of control over the applications of AI on guided missiles. And she's asking specifically aimed at reducing nuclear risk among nuclear possessors. Obviously, AI is quite a buzzy word recently. There's been quite a lot of talk about responsible behavior and AI in the military domain as a potential way forward in advancing arms control agenda. But specifically in this, I wonder, Jeffrey, could you tell us a little bit about to what extent AI is currently used for guided missiles, what might be the applications, and then Kolya, whether you know if regimes such as MTCR or HCOG are interested in understanding the potential implications of such applications and how to control them. Jeffrey, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think that, it's probably important to separate what people typically mean by AI from autonomy, because there's extreme amounts of autonomy that have been in missiles for decades. Once the missile is launched, it's no longer guided from the ground. I mean, the Soviets did radio guidance in the 1950s, but that's kind of the end of that. So, a cruise missile, for example, once it's launched, is going to be told generally where to go. It may use onboard computers to map where it is in terms of terrain. It may use scene matching when it gets to the kind of end game in order to orient itself and attack. And so those systems are already autonomous. I suppose the places that it gets more interesting are in these areas of missile launch detection. So in order to decide whether you may want to launch, if your enemy has launched, might we use greater levels of automation in interpreting those signals? I think that's probably inevitable. Just the more you're trying to fuse and process sensor data, the tendency to want to informationalize that is, I think, inevitable. And so, I think the interesting conversation to have is not really about the missiles or necessarily even the architecture. I think it's very unlikely that people are going to even automate launches. I think the AI conversation lies elsewhere, and that's really about the way in which decision makers are going to use what we would think of as AI, like large language models, for what you might call decision support. And I think that's just generally going to be a problem for military forces that we probably have to wrestle with, not necessarily an issue for missile forces. It may be that as we think about what it's like to live in a world in which AI is ubiquitous, we may want to make different choices about the forces we have. But I think starting with this as a missile problem is probably not the way I would go about it.
Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, AI has been one of the sort of like broad topics that has been discussed across the regimes. I think the discussion is sort of like most focused in the Wassenaar arrangement rather than in the MTCR, exactly for the reasons that Jeffrey mentions. When we look at decision support systems, like that's also very much at the center of the debate that we have on sort of like AI arms control, AI regulation in Geneva. What I would mention is that if you look at the sort of like new space ecosystem, so the new expanding commercial space industry that we see popping up in more and more places, when it comes to like the software side and when it comes to sort of like the analytics and data processing that you need, that you might be interested, both for sort of like space-based sensors, but also when it comes to developing missiles, when it comes to developing materials, testing, particularly when it comes to things like hypersonics. using different types of, and here AI is sort of like used as a very broad term. And to be honest, I'm hardly comfortable saying AI here, but you'll see AI on the brochures of all of those companies. But like there, it's a big thing. So if you look at all the many companies that are popping up in that industry, sort of like it's there in different forms and faces. And so when it comes to actually doing outreach and improving compliance with export controls, for example, by companies in that area, yes, that is very, very relevant actually. And that is part of that conversation that the MTCR is having about, how to address new space as sort of like the trend that is currently shaping the aerospace and space industry.
Thank you very much, both. Henry Boyd and Tim Wright both have a question about the DPRK as a missile exporter. So Henry asked, what do the panelists think that the impact of the burgeoning Moscow-Pyongyang relationship is likely to be on the DPRK as a missile exporter in the future? And for myself, I'll add that there are some very early reporting indicating that the failure rates for North Korean missiles in Ukraine are quite high. So Jeffrey, if you could give us a bit of a more insight into where that missile is developmentally and whether that might have an impact on the attractiveness of similar systems from North Korea for potential other customers. And then Kolya, you mentioned ASEAN quite a lot in your paper. It is one of the very few regional multilateral bodies that is actually actively regularly engaging North Korea. And I was wondering if you could give us a bit of a better idea of what that engagement looks like, and also effectively if what kind of obstacles there are for moving forward on getting North Korea more involved into those kinds of forums. Jeffrey, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think the general observation I would make is that the North Koreans seem to perceive this as being a particularly good time for them, in the sense that they're able to export now significant numbers of weapon systems to Russia. They're, being compensated fairly handsomely for this. And I think that they imagine that as the world, again, kind of divides up into blocks, I think they see opportunities for themselves to continue to become an exporter of armaments. Whether it all works out that way or not, time will tell. But they seem quite confident. I think the issue of failure rates is I think we're all a little bit prisoners to Western munitions success rates. I was quite struck when I was looking at some reliability calculations for US ICBMs from the 1960s, and the calculation suggested using a reliability rate of about 70%, which struck me as unreasonably low. But I think probably in retrospect was probably right for US missiles at that point. Yes, I think the North Korean failure rates are high. I think we've also seen reporting from Reuters that Russian failure rates were in the 40 to 60% range across a variety of systems. And I've seen at least one report that the Iranians suffered about a 50% failure rate with their ballistic missiles. And so it seems that for a lot of countries, ballistic missiles just simply have high failure rates. And the way to solve that problem is quantity. You just accept high failure rates and you build more. And I think that can initially sound sort of silly to us, but the example I always think of is the UK raid on the runway during the Argentine seizure of the Falklands in 1982. It was an enormous effort for the UK to really basically put a single crater on that runway. And so the issue of reliability, that was such a challenging issue, and they had a number of reliability problems with aircraft in that raid, and they just barely got there. Admittedly, it's over rather great distances. Missiles are still, I think, a cheaper and more effective way to do that kind of mission. It just takes a lot of them, but they still have significant advantages in terms of, I think, cost and really not putting pilots at risk. So my guess is the failure rates are sort of disappointing, but at the same time, I mean, the solution is okay with the North Koreans. They just encourage you to buy more.
Yeah, so two things. One, I guess, in the MTCR context, in the past, it has been like common practice of the annual statements from the MTCR plenaries to criticize North Korea's missile testing and behavior, and basically, how it's running counter to the UN resolutions. That is not happening anymore. I mean, obviously, we haven't seen public statements at all in recent years because the members can't agree, and it seems like Russia at least is blocking consensus on those. And I mean, it's sort of like the embodiment of moving away from sort of like the consensus within that group of, pointing out, particularly when it comes to Iran and North Korea, that they're opposed to that. But now not even that is possible anymore, and it leaves us wondering sort of like where that goes in the future, and sort of like how Russia will act there. When it comes to ASEAN engagement with North Korea, so that's mainly through the ASEAN Regional Forum. And I think we have to be realistic in terms of what that can achieve. I mean, it's still an important thing for regional security, I would say, and it's, it has been the place of sort of like some of the engagements between North Korea and South Korea when that really wasn't, established practice yet in the early 2000s. Nowadays, it's good to the extent that the North Koreans are there and sort of like share their view of it, but they are also exposed to being criticized. So if you look at the last statement, for example, from the 30th ARF, it clearly actually criticizes the DPRK in the chairman's statement. So it's good that it sort of like provides that for both sides, but we have to be realistic what can come of that. And as far as I know it's not really been that specific on sort of like missiles, apart from that criticism in terms of actual creating opportunities for engagement.
Thanks a lot, Kolya. We have a couple more minutes, so I'm just going to give you a couple of questions to kind of to choose from. Jeffrey, you mentioned, quantity has a quality of its own. Obviously, with quantity comes economics. And Giorgio Dimitio says, because of the high cost associated with the development and procurement of some Western anti-ship and cruise missiles, does the development of cheaper systems from India and potentially other countries such as Iran pose a proliferation risk? Thank you. And then also, we have a question about what Type 12, upgraded Type 12, Japan's missile could look like, and how different from the original system. And then for Kolya, we have a couple questions about how non-proliferation regimes in the region could address deproliferation of UAV systems as well as anti-satellite weapons. So please feel free to choose from these.
So, for my case, I think the answer for low cost systems is yes. I mean, I think states will want to import things as inexpensively as possible. I think if the ability to import missiles inexpensively exists, there may be that actually may be an inhibitor to the domestic development of certain capabilities. And so I think that, really what we've seen in the past is when capability is unavailable, if states are determined enough, then they are willing to spend that large amount of money, but then they sort of indigenize this. The flip side may be that part of cheapness might involve domestic offsets. So we've already seen that one reason that Poland was particularly interested in South Korea as a supplier is that South Korea was not only willing to just provide the missiles, they also provided a production capability. So I could actually see that going either way, but I think something like BrahMos is going to be very appealing in Southeast Asia. In terms of the follow-on to the Type 12, I mean, I think we don't really know. It's just that the images that we have seen suggest that the missiles looks like it's going to be pretty substantially redesigned, and partly this is just my response is that it's just partly the way the Japanese talk about these things, which is that they always describe each new system as a follow-on, or they describe each new system as an improved version of the older system, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same family as in the past. So I think the Japanese have been quite clear that it's going to have a significantly longer range. I think it's sort of obvious that it's that they want something that is the equivalent of Tomahawk, and I just think that to get there, the engine is the Japanese are very careful about revealing a lot of details. So I'm speculating an enormous amount. But I just think to get there, we're not talking about making an airframe a little bit lighter or packing in a little bit more fuel. Given the scale of changes they're talking about, I would infer we're looking at a new missile. But again, they've been very careful with the details, and so if I turn out to be wrong, I won't be too embarrassed by that.
Yeah, I'll keep it very short. So UAVs, I think, very much we also have that same issue of perceived utility at the moment, very much seeing it in basically all recent and ongoing conflicts, the role that it plays and the interest that states have in it, in UAVs for conventional military missions. That also, again, sort of like challenges the MTCR's approach to it, which basically has them as any other missile delivery system. We already saw the United States change their approach to it and switching to a speed parameter instead. It's become a bit quieter on that topic, to be honest, from what I've heard. But it is a complicated issue, and right now we're certainly seeing that technology is also spreading perhaps even more easily than missile technology. And I'm not sure whether it makes too much sense to, at least sort of like from that export control perspective, to do a distinction when it comes to ASATs, or at least direct ascent weapons that are essentially missile systems. So there, I think it's more a question of how do we deal with that from an arms control perspective, from a transparency perspective, and hopefully, get states to understand from a space security perspective as well, like how massive and disruptive the impact of ASAT use in conflict would be, at least when it comes to direct ascent weapons and the debris that they create and so on. But yeah, I think I'll leave it at that since we're on time.
Thank you very much, both. We went a few minutes over time, but with topic this good, I think that's acceptable. And with that, I wanted to thank you so much, Kolya and Jeffrey, for joining us today and for writing this paper. It's a complex geopolitical and technological reality, but there are plenty of people who are working really hard to understand how to adapt to it. Thank you also to you, to the audience, for joining us and for asking really great questions. You can read this report and other work at IISS.org. And with that, thank you once again and have a good rest of your day.